Hi everyone, we'll just give another minute or two for more people to sign on. Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Smith with the Intentional Endowments Network. We welcome you all to the webinar, Mission Aligned Investing, What New Positive Deviance Research Can Tell Us About What Moves Institutional Investors to Action. All participants are currently on mute, and we encourage you to send questions via the chat function throughout the presentation, and we will compile them and get through as many as we can at the end for a moderated Q&A. The webinar will be recorded and then distributed to all registrants via email and will also be available on the IEN website under webinars. Today's webinar will be based on new in-depth research findings by Dr. Abigail Abrash Walton about what facilitates mission-aligned investing, including leadership and the decision-making process to divest from fossil fuels by philanthropic organizations with assets under management within the range of $5 million to $1 billion. What factors supported decision makers in moving to mission-aligned investing while simultaneously exercising their fiduciary duty to steward institutional assets, and how the divestment decision affected the decision makers personally and their organizations. Before we dive into the presentation, some context about IEN is that we're a collaborative peer learning network advancing intentionally designed endowments. Our approach is to support endowments to learn from and collaborate with each other and finding solutions that work for them at their own pace in accordance with their culture. We do this in 5 main ways. 1, through forums and events. 2, by facilitating knowledge exchange. 3, by creating new resources when needed. And 4, through education and capacity building, and 5, by promoting peer-to-peer networking and learning among endowment stakeholders. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Abrash Walton.
Thank you, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thanks to IEN for hosting this webinar. And as Jackie said, my presentation today draws on an in-depth study that I completed last year of positively deviant institutional investors who are moving toward a mission-aligned approach to stewarding their institutional assets. And at the end of today's session, we're going to provide a site so that you can download the full study. I also look forward to your questions and comments. So let's move to the next slide and dive in with the big picture. And that big picture is that we all know that change can be really challenging. Conventional thinking is usually along the lines of if people just know enough or care enough, they'll change. And we could apply that type of conventional thinking to understanding investing behavior. But we all know that it's not that simple. So if you could click through. In the case of mission-aligned investing, the question is, do knowledge and attitudes really lead to investing behavior that is aligned with those knowledge and attitudes. And what research shows is that there's a significant gap between investors' socially responsible investing knowledge and attitudes and actual socially responsible investing behavior. And studies have yielded somewhat contradictory findings about what actually influences SRI, socially responsible investing, and whether financial or non-financial information is most significant with investors' decision making. So there are, though, some dominant themes in the research literature, and I'm just going to hit those highlights. One is that the majority of socially responsible investors appear to be as concerned as conventional investors are with their investments' financial performance. Secondly, many socially responsible investors understand their investing decisions as an aspect of their identity or lifestyle. They want to translate their social beliefs and values to their financial activities, and they're frequently members of other social engagement groups through which they might be more encouraged to engage in this type of investing choice. And thirdly, many conventional investors also value the non-financial or socially responsible performance of their investments. So if we want to move investors to close that gap between knowledge, attitudes, and investing behaviors, the question is, what works? And to answer this question, my study focus was on fossil fuel divestment. Now, institutional investors have conventionally relied quite heavily on fossil fuel holdings as a mainstay of investment portfolios, and therefore changing this particular investing behavior could be really challenging. So I used a leading behavior change research model to explore what explained the readiness of institutional investors to move their assets out of fossil fuels and into clean renewable energy sources and other types of investments. So today I'm going to share with you my findings about why leaders pursued mission-aligned investing and how they did this successfully. So if you could click again. What the study revealed provides insights into both what facilitates mission-aligned investing, as well as key factors supporting top decision makers' movement in this direction while simultaneously exercising their fiduciary duty, and also how making a commitment to mission-aligned investing benefited these decision makers personally as well as their institutions. So next slide, please. I want to just give a very quick overview of this, this behavior change model that is the theoretical framework for the study. And the most important thing to know about the trans-theoretical model of behavior change is that it suggests that individuals can move through different stages of readiness to engage in a new behavior, and that there are specific processes that can support the change. So knowledge and attitudes are necessary, but they're insufficient factors in moving people to action. And the TTM, as it's known, contemplates those dimensions with these four constructs. Stages of readiness to engage in the behavior, decisional balance, which is sort of a fancy academic way of saying the pros and the cons that are seen as being associated with that behavior. Self-efficacy, which just simply is to understand whether people feel confident in their ability to engage in this new behavior, to change. And then 10 processes of change that can facilitate behavior change along these lines. And this is really an integrative psychological model for understanding and facilitating behavior change. Researchers have been using this model for more than 30 years and have used it to study more than 50 behaviors globally. It's also the basis for one of the leading therapeutic approaches to facilitating behavior change by individual therapists and counselors. So, moving along to the next slide, I want to talk about the positive deviance aspect of this study. When you want to facilitate a change, a really effective approach to research is to look at populations that are engaging in that preferred change, especially when that behavior is aggregated at an organizational or a sectoral scale and to analyze what has facilitated their success. So you're looking for what we call the positive deviants, those who are acting outside the norms of their sector. And I wanted to look at this change of investing behavior, and the fossil fuel divestment movement was an obvious candidate. This is an active and growing divestment movement that's emerged during the past 6 years, beginning with student-led initiatives aimed at securing university endowment divestment of corporate coal holdings initially, and now oil and gas holdings as well. And the movement has grown to include divestment of all fossil fuel company holdings and reinvestment of those resources in climate solution-oriented approaches, including clean energy technologies. And there's some excellent studies out there that provide a much higher level of detail about the divestment movement itself. You'll find those at the end of my presentation in the reference section. But as of December 2016, globally, more than 688 organizations and more than 58,000 individuals from 76 countries with reported assets of $5 trillion had committed to fossil fuel divestment. And so what you see here is that that represents about 7% of global stock market value. Next slide, please. So within the divestment phenomenon, I studied a specific population of positively deviant leaders who, again, were acting intentionally outside the norms of their sector, in this case, the norms of typical corporate governance and norms within the philanthropic sector to break away from investing in fossil fuels. And the population for my study were US-based foundation leaders whose institutions had publicly committed to fossil fuel divestment through the Divest Invest Philanthropy Initiative. And these foundations have really emerged as leaders in this innovative change movement. What you can see here on the slide is that beginning in January 2014, there were just 17 US-based foundations that had made this commitment. That number has risen to 155 as of this month globally, with an asset increase to $12.3 billion. So assets that have been committed to or already divested from fossil fuels have grown to nearly 600% by nearly 600%. Next slide, please. So this was an interesting part of the divestment universe to research, and I was interested in philanthropy specifically because the dynamics of the change decision making there were, from my view as a researcher, different from what we might see on higher ed campuses, where there's sometimes a confrontational campaigning approach by students. In this case, these were organizations that unilaterally, apparently without any external intervention, decided that they were going to commit to this unconventional investing choice. And so here what you see are the descriptive information about the participants in this study. So we all can recognize that in organizations, effective change leadership is really enhanced by, is led by C-suite executive action. And so the population for my study were presidents, CEOs, board chairs, executive directors, the top decision makers within these organizations who had been directly involved with the divestment decision-making process. And out of a total population of 36 US foundations at the time of my data collection, I interviewed half. I interviewed 18 senior foundation leaders from across the US. And you can see here that assets under management ranged from under 10 million, actually the smallest was $500,000, up to well over 100 million in institutional assets, up to the $1 billion range. Next slide, please. So first, from the findings, I want to talk about the investing behavior and why these leaders and their organizations decided to pursue institutional divestment. And the key finding was and this surprised me actually. I had imagined that the key reason would be concern about or awareness of climate change. And that certainly was a significant factor. However, mission alignment was the most often referenced motivation for divestment. And participants talked about their divestment commitments within a broader movement toward mission-aligned investing rather than as a standalone pro-environmental act. Divestment was a specific investing behavior change. It was motivated by an awareness of and a desire to address climate change, and within a context of bringing investing behavior into alignment with organizational mission, values, vision, and in some cases, grant making. So leaders used words such as evolution and continuum to describe the story behind the organization's divestment decision. As one board leader stated, divestment became a specific concept for us about 3 years ago, and it was a part of a much broader trend with mission alignment. So this progression involved a shift in mental models. Another board leader situated divestment in this way: it's a whole shift in thinking of a foundation's assets as there to support the growth and the continuity of the foundation, but is also useful in supporting social and mission-related goals. And if you're not thinking that way, then you're not going to really get into divestment and reinvestment. So these participants were contrasting their own organizational mission-aligned investing stance with what they viewed as the norm for the philanthropic sector. And as one leader put it, there's still a lot of people that are unwilling or unable to get their mind around the idea that they don't need to have Exxon in their portfolio. There's still a preponderance of investment people who have the idea that it's okay to make a mess over here. It just gives us more dollars to give away for cleanup over here. And that type of thinking never really worked, but we allowed ourselves to believe it, and we should be smarter than that now. Another executive said, there's a realization that these are not two separate organizations, one that makes grants and one that makes investments, and never the twain shall meet. The benefit is an understanding that your investments can serve your mission or they can hurt your mission. You're either undercutting potentially your grants with your investments, or you're being inconsistent values-wise, but you're also leaving money on the table, leaving tools on the table that could be used in service of your mission. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I want to share with you this conceptual model that I derived from my analysis of the data. And this model was actually a key finding of this study, and it suggests that there are different levels of mission-aligned investing that institutional investors can move through. And that first level, level one, is the conventional firewall between investment decisions within the organization and decision making based on mission and values regarding grant making and other types of activities. And these participants described that starting place of being siloed, where the investment committees within the organizations were making investment decisions completely disconnected from any of the programmatic activities of these organizations. And what moved through these levels was an increasing level of engagement in mission-aligned investing. So beyond that baseline of level one, in which investing decisions are completely separate from considerations of organizational mission, vision, values, and in this case, grant making, each level beyond that represents an increasing degree of mission-aligned investing, moving from passive to fully engaged. And for those of you on this webinar who have a lot of experience in this area, you could understand level two as being the level at which institutional investors might passively be selecting from a pre-screened menu of investment products where they've determined that they, for example, don't want to invest in nuclear, they don't want to invest in animal testing. those kinds of products having already been made available to them as options by investment professionals. And then beyond that, moving to level 3, which is a more active mission-aligned and socially responsible investing stance, where institutions are actually moving into voting their proxies for annual meetings, where they might actually be engaging collaboratively in the development of shareholder resolutions, where they might be actually sitting down at the table with corporate management for companies whose actions they seek to change. And what's significant about this conceptual model is that level 4, divestment, is that proactive moment when these institutional investors, these decision makers, decided to draw a line in the sand and to recognize that their efforts in level 2 and level 3 weren't achieving the outcomes that they wanted to see in the world, and that divestment, removing their assets from companies whose fossil fuel extraction they were opposed to, was for them the logical decision. And once they had made that decision, once they'd made that commitment, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit, it really opened up the way to reimagining and redirecting where those institutional assets could be deployed. And so for many of these leaders, they and their organizations had moved on to level 5 of mission and program related investing, where they were becoming far more proactive in seeking out the kinds of investment products, and in some cases, the products don't yet exist, but seeking to figure out how they were going to move investments towards achieving ultimately level 6 of being fully engaged with 100% mission-aligned investing. And for some of this population that I studied, those organizations had actually achieved level 6. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So I introduced you earlier to this behavior change model, and I explained that what we can learn from this is that at any given moment in time, people are not always at the same stage of readiness to engage in a change. And so what I looked at in this study was applying this TTM framework to my data to understand why and how leaders moved along the stages of behavior change readiness continuum, from contemplation, which is thinking about making the change, to preparation, which is the point at which you commit to making the change, to action, which is where you are actually implementing that change, to maintenance, which suggests that you've been maintaining that change for more than 6 months. Next slide, please. So moving from contemplation to preparation and action can be easier or more challenging. And the median time frame for a decision to divest with my study population was 5 months. And decision time frames ranged from 1 day, where this decision was taken within the span of 1 meeting, to 1 year, which required a more in-depth process. And the mission-aligned investing model that I showed you a few slides ago offers key contextual conditions that help to explain why the foundation leaders in this study were ready to divest. However, the model does not explain the differences among organizations in terms of the time it took to move from contemplation to preparation. So to shed additional light on that process, I developed this typology of organizational readiness to commit to divestment. And the typology offers a framework for understanding the degree of challenge presented by the divestment decision. And I've termed the 3 general categories of organizational readiness as an easy decision, an engaged decision, and a challenging decision. And here you can see the key factors that influenced Foundation Board's ease of decision-making and committing to divestment. So under an easy decision, having a clear consensus on organizational values, viewing divestment as consistent with the organization's mission, having already a clear decision-making process in place for investment decisions was also critically important. And of course, already being focused on mission-aligned investing made the decision much easier. For those organizations that fell into the category of an engaged decision, in those cases, the organization might be inclined, but more tentative about immediate action. The decision required thoughtful research about the impact of the divestment decision. It, in some cases, involved significant education of the board, and it also included belief or confidence that there would be no negative impact of divestment. And then for those organizations that experienced a challenging decision, there was significant internal concern, a split board with significantly differing views. Divestment was viewed as controversial by board members or difficult, and the process to get to a decision, to get to commitment, required an internal champion and extensive research to inform that decision. Next slide, please. Now, for individual leaders, this conceptual model shows what leaders themselves were thinking about, feeling, and doing as they considered, prepared for, implemented, and maintained the divestment behavior change. And what you'll see as people moved through these stages of readiness to engage in this new investing behavior, one thing that was critically important for all stages there at the top was engaging effective support from investment advisors. This was an absolutely critical piece of their ability to move through the process. You can see a number of different factors that were relevant at different stages of readiness. So in contemplation, that decisional balance piece that I spoke about earlier, and I'll present to you in just a minute, considering the implications of divestment, educating themselves about the feasibility of divestment, engaging the board in conversation about this possibility. Moving on to preparation or commitment, here was the most surprising finding of this aspect of the study, and that was the first bullet point you see there, that bullet point about feeling good, positive emotions about making the commitment to divest. And those positive emotions were strongly associated with the divestment commitment. Participants in this study described feeling elation, relief, liberation, satisfaction, and pride. And these positive emotions amplified their commitment and appeared to provide energy to move from preparation on into action. As one executive in the study said, it felt exhilarating. It's just really one of those moments where you put your money where your mouth is. So that was a critical piece of moving from preparation and then moving to action, making a plan for divestment, defining what to divest, identifying alternative investments, and then in terms of maintenance, including fossil fuel divestment in the investment policy statement and continuous, very clear monitoring of investments. So if you move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about this notion of decisional balance and what participants viewed as being the pros and the cons. And as I said earlier, the desire to align investing with mission, vision, values, and grant making was a top pro. The desire to address climate change, not just from a moral perspective, but also in terms of being prudent investors and being mindful of their fiduciary duty, this notion of stranded assets and concerns about the eventual economic problems that would be associated with continuing to hold those fossil fuel assets in the portfolio. Thirdly, the desire to exercise leadership. And this was linked to that fifth point there, the view of divestment as an investment opportunity that was going to send market signals to catalyze new investment services and products and to influence public policy. And for these leaders, they recognized that while the products and the services that they were looking for might not already be there, they viewed their decision, their public decision to divest, as being a contributor to catalyzing the emergence of new services and products that would make it easier for other investors following in their footsteps to divest from fossil fuel holdings. And then that fourth bullet point is a really interesting one. Efficacy and feasibility of divestment. So recognizing that divestment was both feasible, it was possible, they had the ability to engage in divestment, and often this was based on personal past activist experience. So a number of participants referenced their earlier engagement with the anti-apartheid divestment movement focused on South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, and how important that earlier experience had been for them personally in terms of shaping their understanding about how feasible and efficacious divestment as a strategy could be. And so one leader said, you know, it was a no-brainer to do this. We know that divestment works. And so those were the considerations for leaders in terms of the pros that they saw with taking this decision. In the cons category, you know, there was concern about the time involved in researching and implementing the decision, a recognition that it was going to take some time and effort. And of course, for some people, the potential for decreased performance of the investment portfolio was another concern. So moving along to the next slide, we're going to look at factors that affected leaders' sense of self-efficacy, their sense that it was possible to do this, to divest. And so here you see a laundry list of factors that were important. If you would click again, I want to highlight one particular factor, which was changing investment advisors. And out of this list of factors, this actually was one that a number of participants mentioned, and viewed this as being a critical piece of enabling them and their organizations to follow through on the divestment commitment. So, as one executive shared, we made the very tough decision that we needed to exit from the relationship with our investment advisors and find a new outsourced chief investment officer who would be more able to help us realize our mission-aligned investing goals. Another leader said, we're with this traditional company, we're not the only ones talking to them about divestment, but they're not fast to jump on anything. So in terms of implementation, eventually we may need to move to a socially responsible firm. So this piece was an interesting finding in terms of leaders, you know, real acts of leadership and recognizing that they were going to need to make a change, not only in terms of how they were investing their assets, but what kind of professional services support they were going to need in order to be successful in doing that. And a number of these leaders mentioned that at various times they'd been told by their investment advisors, by other professionals, that this was going to be a very difficult change, that it was not a possible change. And the act of leadership here was recognizing that there were other options and actually moving to changing the investment advisors. Conversely, in some cases, investment advisors played a really critical role in providing decision makers, organizational decision makers, with the information that they needed, so that that next bullet point that you see there, effective support from investment advisors. In some cases, the investment advisors were bringing divestment to these decision makers as a possible choice and really facilitating their ability to move through it. So I want to next turn to the final slide that covers this model, and that is these processes of change that I referenced at the beginning. And there are 10 processes of change in the model. How you apply them depends on where a person is in terms of their readiness to engage in a particular change. So there are certain processes that are most important during contemplation, or even prior to that, pre-contemplation, where the decision to make this change is not even on a person's radar screen, or they might be dismissive of the importance of making the change, or in denial about their ability to, having doubt about their ability to make the change. So, you know, that first process of change is really consciousness raising. It's providing information. It's helping them to move to having an understanding about what the implications of maintaining their current decision might be versus making the change, both externally in terms of the recognition of impacts on other people, and in this case on ecological systems when we're talking about fossil fuels and climate change, but also looking at that self-reevaluation piece that I've got highlighted here, which is really being thoughtful about the implications of making the change for themselves. And other factors that are important here in terms of the processes of change is this piece that's sort of awkwardly termed social liberation, but it's recognizing that the world around you is changing to support the new behavior, and in this case recognizing that there is a divestment movement and resources available through movement organizers and investment professionals and others to support that divestment decision. Self-liberation is the process where people are making the commitment, in this case the divestment commitment, and then that crucially important helping relationships process of change, which is engaging the support, the effective support of investment advisors and movement organizers and others. Moving on to the final stages that are really helpful during the action and maintenance stages of change, reinforcement management, so positive performance of the portfolio would be an example of that. Post-divestment, getting positive feedback from others about the divestment decision. Counter-conditioning, which is the reinvestment, in this case, of institutional assets into climate solutions. And stimulus control, which is actions to include fossil fuel divestment in the foundation investment policy statement. So actually embedding that decision, embedding the commitment to that decision right there in the investment policy statement of the organization can be hugely helpful in terms of supporting the maintenance of the change. Next slide, please. So I finally want to wrap up with this next piece, which is how did these leaders describe the impact of the divestment decision on themselves and their organizations? And I was intrigued to find that participants' positively deviant mission-aligned leadership did lead to outcomes for them personally, for their organizations, and other philanthropic institutions, and actually for the financial services sector as well. So I'm going to just share a few examples. You can turn to the full report for many more examples. But first, on the personal level, pursuing divestment changed some participants in generative ways. And as I showed you in that earlier slide about the relationship between the unleashing of positive emotions connected with the commitment to divestment, one leader said, "It energized me to make this commitment. I learned a lot more about investments. I developed tremendous new relationships with foundation colleagues." For another participant in the study, for that person, he said, "I'd say what the exercise did for me is it awakened me to the whole climate change movement, and it made it no longer convenient to ignore the connection of climate change to economic activities and the actions of individual institutional investors." In terms of organizational impact, while not foreseen or planned for, the evolution to mission-aligned investing, and specifically in this case the divestment decision, in some cases yielded important and generative organizational benefits. And these outcomes were financial savings, a newly energized board and staff, and a new norm for the organization of removing that separation, that firewall between investing and program decisions. So as another executive put it, embarking on this mission-aligned approach overall did three things. It ended up saving us money because we took such a deep dive into our investments. Second, it energized our board about the investments in a way that they hadn't been before. And third, we now have our investment committee and our program staff meeting together. So it also energized our staff to think about what they could be doing with the investments, whether it's through divestment, investment, asset activism like shareholder resolutions or proxy voting, etc. So it had very positive consequences for our institution. And finally, in terms of sectoral change in the form of financial sector products and service innovations, one executive put it this way. He said, our advisors now consider fossil fuel divestment a niche business for them, so they're running with it as fast as they can. And what you'll see if you go to the full study is that these participants were able to give really specific examples of the way in which their decisions to make this unconventional choice to shift to mission-aligned investing had indeed catalyzed the emergence of new products and services that were paving the way for others and also yielding for them beneficial investment opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. So moving to the next slide, this is the final slide of my presentation today. And in closing, I think we all know the old theory of change. If people just know or care enough, they'll change. And my research focuses on that TTM framework and how it provides a much more comprehensive approach to understanding and facilitating mission-aligned investing behavior, and specifically on the role of individual and organizational values on mobilizing effective change. So the final takeaways, if you could click next. I mean, we all know that investing behavior matters, and what I focused on in this study was that organizational leadership really matters in terms of decision making. And to close the gap between knowledge and attitudes on the one hand and behavior on the other, it's important to be aware of and to remember these four things. The first is that people are at different stages of readiness to engage in that behavior change. And in order to help to facilitate people along a process, you could click through. You need to really be supporting them in considering the pros and the cons, moving to a place where the pros outweigh the cons. And click again. Supporting and facilitating their ability to feel confident about making the change. And lastly, if you could click one more time, referencing back to these 10 proven techniques for facilitating change. So I want to thank you for your attendance, your participation. I'm ready to open this up to discussion and have some conversation.
Great, thank you. Can you speak a little bit about how influential culture is as a factor in the decision-making process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here I'm gonna presume that the question is about organizational culture, perhaps. Is there more specificity about what type of culture we're talking about?
There isn't, but yes, I think that that's what they were aiming for.
Yeah, right. So organizational culture isn't explicitly a dimension of what I studied. However, if you harken back to that typology of organizational readiness to commit to moving to mission-aligned investing, to moving in the direction of divestment and mission-aligned investing, organizational culture did play a role. And what was most interesting from my perspective in terms of the findings was that, if you think about that category of what facilitated an easy decision, it was easiest for organizations that already had that clear consensus on organizational values and that were already clear about how decision-making about investments would take place. And it's surprising, perhaps, but to those of you who are professionals working in this field, maybe not so much, that that's not always the case, that there is not always a situation in which decision makers on the board have gone through a process of clarifying and reaching consensus about organizational values, that in some cases, especially with family foundations, there may not be a clear decision-making process for how these kinds of perhaps unconventional decisions about investing can be pursued. And so to the extent that, organizational leaders are diligent about facilitating their boards and working closely with their investment advisors to go through those processes of putting in place the foundation stones for effective decision making, that can be enormously helpful. And there were plenty of examples in this study of organizations that fell into that category of challenging decision, where there was a lot of controversy around this decision and a lot of significant internal concern about it. And in those cases, the emergence of an internal champion was really important in terms of continuing to move the ball forward in an organizational culture where there was dissension.
Thank you. On a related note, was it easier for foundations that have programmatic focus on climate change for grant making to divest? And if a foundation's mission was to support the arts, for example, did that make the case for mission aligned more difficult?
Yeah, that's a great question, and honestly, I didn't find a correlation between the mission of these foundations and the ease of decision making. And so, there were some foundations in this population that didn't engage in grant making focused on climate change. In fact, there was one sizable foundation with assets under management of more than 100 million that their position was that they had actively avoided making any grants in the realm of climate change action because they felt that it was just too big a challenge for them as an organization to unpack, and they had not been able to figure out how they could feel effective in engaging in grant making in the climate change space. So they were really focused on geographically proximate projects close to where the foundation is headquartered, and in a variety of different types of programming, involving environmental projects, but also other types of charitable giving, other types of grant making. And so that was interesting because in that case, they decided on divestment absent any consensus within the board or among the staff about a position on climate change. And at the same time, there were organizations that were actively engaged in grant making focused on climate change, where it took a longer period of time to get to a decision, primarily because of the size of the board and the number of people on the investment committee who, harking back to that conceptual model of levels of mission-aligned investing, were still possibly at level 1 in terms of their thinking. They were very making these decisions very separate from what the programmatic staff were doing in terms of the grant making. Mm. And for sure, for some of the smaller foundations where they were actively engaged in grant making to support climate change action, mitigation action, and campaigning, for those smaller organizations, it was often not the case. I mean, they certainly didn't fall into the challenging decision category, but many of them had to go through what I term an engaged decision-making process, where they still had to connect the dots for themselves. They still had to do the research to be confident that making this divestment decision was not going to harm the performance of the portfolio. And as one board chair said, that the head of the investment committee of that organization, which actually supports quite a number of activist and movement-oriented programs, said, is this really the kind of money that we're prepared to lose? Because that person heading the investment committee had the assumption that I think may be commonly shared, which is that divestment was going to harm the portfolio. And what I found in the study was actually that, and you heard this in that presentation piece that I made about the organizational impact, there was not a single participant in this study who reported having experienced a decrease in the performance of the portfolio post-divestment. In fact, for a number of the participants, they reported actually having improved the performance of their portfolio for some of the reasons that I shared with you in that excerpt. That idea of taking such a deep dive into the holdings of the organization, of the institution, that they found hidden fees that they didn't need to be paying. They found inefficiencies in the way that they were invested. And by actively shining a spotlight on their investments, they improved the performance of those investments. Another one of the participants said, that their investment advisor, accused them of somehow being able to read the future because they made the divestment decision before coal holdings tanked, before oil and gas tanked, and that they had been doing better than some of the other clients that this investment advisor served. And so, that's a long answer to a great question.
And when measuring the success financially, how do you determine when lack of success or loss will then need to drive the organization's investment decisions?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. I'm not sure that I can answer that question because with the population whom I studied, none of them were reporting a loss or a downturn in terms of performance, and none of them were at the stage that I was conducting these interviews concerned about that. In fact, they were pretty energized about the decisions that they'd made to move in a mission-aligned investing direction, and very, very confident about the ability of the mission-aligned investing choices that they were making to perform at least as well, if not better than, conventional choices in the energy sector. So, if you take a look at the longer study, you'll see a number of excerpts from the data from these interviews where leaders are talking about their confidence that that this mission-aligned approach was feasible, it was viable, and that it was working well for them. So it's a great question, but one that I can't answer.
Thank you. Recognizing that the focus was on foundations, what are your thoughts on how much of this might translate to higher ed endowments, and what are the key differences?
Yeah, so there are obviously a number of higher ed organizations, institutions that have made the commitment to divest and have moved in that direction already successfully. And the dynamics here with philanthropy are different in the sense that there's not the same dynamic of bottom-up movement, organizing, focused on decision makers to make this change. So, in this case, nobody was actively lobbying or pressuring these philanthropic leaders to make this change in the same way that we see on some college and university campuses where there are student campaigns focused on this, and faculty might also be involved in those campaigns. And so the power dynamics of the decision making are very different. And I think one of the factors that people might usefully look at is peer-to-peer peer-to-peer networking on this and peer-to-peer communication. And when higher ed institution decision makers are able to hear from others who are respected and trusted messengers also in the field of higher ed about the process of making this decision as well as the outcomes of making the decision, I think that can be very helpful. But there's no substitute as well for effective student-led activism. And students can be enormously persuasive in terms of moving the agenda forward. I think even more so than faculty, and it's always great if you can identify an ally or two within the board of your higher ed institution who gets it. And all the research shows that familiarity with socially responsible investing more generally, and in the case of my study, past personal experience with divestment, oftentimes as activists themselves, made it much easier for these leaders, these decision makers, to embrace the divestment commitment. But what you also saw in my presentation is that accessing the kinds of resources that IEN produces and makes available to support decision making can also be extremely helpful. So, with respect to demonstrating the feasibility of a divestment decision, really doing an analysis for decision makers that can show them what pre and post divestment might look like is a super helpful way of helping them to follow along with your reasoning, to follow along with your logic about how to get this done.
And do you think it's important when using the resources in making these decisions that it's a non-biased party that's providing the resources, or can you speak a little bit about the types of resources that are useful in these decisions?
Sure. For the population that I studied, they were pointing specifically to the Carbon Tracker 200 tool as the most useful and effective way for them to define what constituted divestment and what did not. So looking at which specific companies were named in the Carbon Tracker 200, and then honing in on divestment from those specific corporations. So being able to define what to divest was really important, and that tool in particular was a tool that a number of participants explicitly named as being useful in terms of informing their decision making. And their, again, to the point of self-efficacy, their feelings that they were able to actually both define what divestment meant and that they would be able to identify which specific holdings they wanted to divest. So that's a really specific tool. Again, to the point of that I made earlier about the importance of investment professionals in this process, being able to turn to trusted, can-do oriented investment professionals was another critical resource for these folks. And thinking about the range of tools and resources that are out there, there are certainly a number of them, but the tools and resources provided by IEN, the Carbon Tracker 200, those are all helpful places to start.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more. Did all institutions use an investment advisor or consultant? And among those with advisors, how many of the institutions use an outsourced CIO versus a non-discretionary investment consultant?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a level of detail that my study did not examine. It's actually a really interesting question for a follow-up study to ask that question. I can tell you that all of the institutions, minus, let me be certain about this. There were a handful in that population of 18 that had internal investment professionals who were supporting their decision making. Most of the population used external investment advisors or consultants. It was a rarer thing for them to have an in-house capacity to both engage in the research as well as the decision making.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Abrash Walton, and thank you to all participants. If you're interested in learning more about supporting the network, please send me an email or visit our website at www.intentionalendowments.org. And we also encourage you to stay connected with us by signing up for our listservs. And if we were not able to get to your question, please reach out to us and we will certainly follow up. Thank you again and have a great day.